Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a video commenting on the unbelievable broadcast between Glen Scrivener and Matt Dillahunty. Morality, can atheism deliver a better world? I thought the conversation was very good. I very much anticipated hearing it, and it didn't disappoint, and so I recommend listening to it. As always, when you listen to something like this, think about the question, how are we using the term God in the conversation and in our lives? What do we mean by God? How do we imagine God acts? What role does God play in morality? What do we mean by morality, and how do we know what the better is? So let's jump in about 30 minutes when really the conversation sort of gets going. There we go.
Mention. I would agree that if there were a God, we'll stick with the Christian God so that we don't have to drag everybody else into it today. But if there were a God, that would be a sufficient explanation for why some of these devout religious tendencies seem to be beneficial to the practitioner.
Okay, so the idea is that we're trying to fill in the world, to understand how the world works, and that there's I can't, if you finish up Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, and I'm reading this book right now, Transubstantiation, Theology, History, and Christian Unity. A copy of this was sent to me by the author, Brett Salkeld. And it's a tremendous book. It's really clear in terms of walking through Scotus, Occam, the history of the Fourth Lateran Council, and the entire idea of the relationship between God and the world. Is God, can we rightly call God a being? Or is God being itself, but in a way that isn't pantheistic? Is God the ground of all being, yet separate from the existence we live? In fact, when I listen to a conversation like I'm listening here, to a degree, the God number two has so taken over the conversation that Christians and atheists tend to battle on the ground of God number two. And you can hear that in Dillahunty's arguments against the existence of God. You also hear, again, I think Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, there's so much helpful information in that in terms of sort of laying the landscape of, where do Matt Dillahunty's assumptions about truth come from? This kind of correspondence between this and that. But of course, Heidegger rushes in and says, no, there's actually an arena here that upon which all of these relationships of correspondence are dependent. So, but again, we can't help but talk in shortcuts. We have to talk in shortcuts. And so, in other words, what Dillahunty is sort of looking towards is this argument of the God of the gaps, that we used to be able to explain things in the world. We could explain the order that we find. We could explain the seeming design, the miraculous functionality of the seemingly never-ending complexity of the world. We could explain all of that by a designer. Now, this stands in direct competition with a Darwinian view of the world that says, well, it all sort of emerged through processes, but there is no telos, there is no design, there is no intentionality. It all simply happened. And they'll actually get into questions of Darwin in this conversation as well. Again, I thought there's a lot in this conversation that's worth talking about.
In the same way that if there were a God, that would explain some of the things that creationists point to with regard to design. My concerns on these are separate. Yes, of course, that would be sufficient. But is it actually true? Because we've done this over and over again, where we make an inference to an explanation based on whatever limited knowledge and information we have right now. and then we find out later we got it wrong. And every time we found out later that we got it wrong, it was scientific exploration and discovery that found out it was wrong. And at no point have we ever found out we were wrong about a God.
Now, I'm really intrigued by this argument, and I've heard variations. Sam Harris presents a variation of it. It's sort of a take on the subtraction story. It's sort of like running the subtraction story in reverse, where we used to account for the world by pointing to a designer that yielded again the immensely functional complexity that we marvel at even as we go deeper. But then science comes along and explains it in a way that replaces God. Now again, built into that scenario is a certain imagination of God. It would sort of be like arguing that it's really incredible how an airplane's wing creates lift. Now we know there isn't a God because now we understand about the differentiation of high and low air pressure and how a wing works. And so that doesn't really make the existence of the Wright brothers fictitious or non-fictitious, because obviously the arena, the natural order as we call it, has this potential to allow these dynamics, and just pointing to the dynamics themselves can't really address whether or not there is intentionality in the dynamics within the natural order. Now, most of the skepticism with respect to the goodness of a designer is based on the fact that these dynamics tend to lead towards our hurt often. That tectonic shifts lead towards tsunamis and earthquakes, and volcanoes can destroy villages, and mosquitoes can spread viruses and malaria, and that this causes suffering. And so this doesn't necessarily address the question of whether or not there's design beneath the potential, but it very much addresses it doesn't address the question of suffering, which comes down the road. But it's very interesting how we sort of have this subtraction story, the Charles Taylor subtraction story in reverse, that, here's something that we can now explain before there was a God, and now we can explain it because we see the natural processes. What we don't in any way explain is why the natural processes can in fact lead to, why there's so much potential in the system that through whatever process you want to imagine, let's call it emergence, which our rule says is the big, it's the big hand waving thing, that emergence can yield. Obviously, it's, let's say if you say, well, I have this glass full of highly with a water full of sugar in solution, and I put a string down and the crystals develop in and of themselves. They develop on their own. That doesn't explain the chemistry, the existence of the chemistry, the potential in the water for the rock candy to develop.
What do you make of that, Glen?
Well, is secular humanism new? In one sense, yes, quite new. In another sense, I think it's a repackaging of Christianity light.
And if you look at Glen's talk to Tom Holland, that's Tom Holland's big argument, that essentially humanism is Christianity light. And I think that's, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in this video.
I do think Nietzsche's critique holds that secular humanism tends to be Christianity where God is swapped out for the good.
Okay, now I want to come back to that because I want to first touch a little bit more on God. Now, I want to bring in my conversation that I just had with Voth, because I think he nicely laid out the Jordan Peterson argument. Now, Jordan Peterson's God the ontology of Jordan Peterson's God, Jordan Peterson leaves as an open-ended question. We can't... Jordan Peterson basically... I haven't talked about Jordan for a while. Jordan basically asserts that that's a private question for him, and so he doesn't need to answer it. But so ontology aside, he doesn't want to close that door, yes or no. That's why I call him an open agnostic. But basically his argument is that when we use the word God, we're looking at something like what I would call as an intersubjective community orientation device. And I thought Voth set this up quite nicely in the little conversation that we had.
Like, at this point, it's pretty cliche to say that, you know, something started by hearing...
I just asked him how he had found my video channel.
Jordan Peterson, but... and to be honest, like, I distilled his shtick out really quick and moved on from him because he's pretty repetitive.
Yeah.
But I think what got me is he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he explained God to me in a way for the first time that I could ever understand it. Because, like, I'm sort of a hobby psychologist. Like, I have like a lot of psychology books that I've read, and actually a lot of economics books, but I consider economics like a subset of psychology. Like, the people who add too many numbers to it end up getting lost, but that's beside the point. What I'm trying to get at is the psychological significance of God is what he was going for, and that really worked for me, because it was like, he was on Joe Rogan and he said, God is a collection of all the things that worked. He more or less explained it in an evolutionary process. So he says, you know, if you got a village and the guy who did the things that worked the best, that everyone tries to emulate, is the hero. And then when you have, you know, everyone from within the various cities, you know, all the things that correlated between the heroes gets distilled into the legend. And when all the legends have all their stuff distilled down into one, eventually you get to the God. And I was like, that makes freaking sense. You know, that actually makes sense to me. You know, it's the ideal of the ideal of the ideal. It's the highest point to which you aim at. And that spoke to me because that's always the way I've looked at the world. You know, one of the biggest differentiating factors between like someone who is extremely like left-wing socialist type and then someone who's like, you know, over here it's hierarchy versus equality, you know, that sort of intersection. Sure. And I, not intentionally, it's just the way I am, I tend to see people as winners and losers. And so when I see someone who's failing, you know, I might try to tell them, you know, or help them, or, you know, advise them and whatnot. But, you know, I still, in my mind, categorize them as loser, and you know, they need to figure out a way to help themselves. And, you know, people who are winners, theoretically, they're doing something right. You should try to emulate them. And so it's like, you know, what's the absolute top of the hierarchy is the ultimate ideal. And so when he explained it that way, it made sense to me.
Now what's interesting about Dillahunty is that he notes many times that he's a secular humanist. The atheism for Dillahunty is sort of a thin fact, and what he wants to promote is essentially whatever is behind secularism, where, you know, secular humanism, wherever it came from, you know, that's incidental. But now, since we have this tool that we call science, which is usually something that they don't peer into terribly. For all the load they place on it, that they tend to not examine what it can and cannot yield. And this, of course, gets very much into the question of morality, because can science give us morality? And what we tend to find is that there is actually a pretty good section in this conversation about that too. But I would argue that, okay, so if we want to leave the ontology of God off the table, the way God functions sociologically, the way God functions psychologically, and I think, again, this is, again, part of the big payload of Jordan Peterson, how he really managed to change people dramatically and really moved a lot of people from sort of this, oh yeah, atheism, to, well, maybe this God business is functional, again, as sort of an intersubjective community orientation device. It's sort of the top of the hierarchy. And so over time, this is how we actually learn what we should do. Now we're treading into morality, what we should do for what? To give us outcomes that we desire, to give us, you know, less disease instead of more disease, to give us more food instead of less food, to give us more peace and less war, to give us more prosperity. I mean, all of these things, if we're not looking too deep into telos, that well, this God and communities that use this intersubjective community orientation device that we are calling God, communities that use this, you know, tend to thrive over communities that don't. And this is where we get into the question of God as an adaptation, that God as an idea, as an intersubjective community orientation device, tends to afford an advantage of communities that engage in this process over communities that don't. Now, again, I think I'm going to post this after the video that I've already recorded, but not yet posted, on Brett Weinstein and his talk with Jim Rutt, I think that's the guy's name, his talk with Sam Harris, that if religion is in fact an adaptation, and the adaptation offers an advantage, and the idea of God, and now again I said we have polytheism and monotheism, okay, that the idea of God somehow offers the community an adaptive advantage, then you have the question of, well, why, if that is true historically, why now must we leave it behind? That's a difficult thing to demonstrate. Now, I think Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris would say, well, now we have science. And I would argue, well, that's a little difficult, because I'd say this scientific process is, in fact, all the way along in this development. And if, again, you go back to the Tom Holland video where he's talking about the Roman emperors sort of trying out gods, in many ways that's sort of a scientific process. But it's a vast one where because you don't have enough time to for one generation. So you look back and you use the accumulated wisdom of generations, but then you have to make the choice in real time, and so you try it out. And I find people actually continue to do this in all kinds of ways. People will often, when someone visits church for the first time, and as a pastor, I almost always sort of imagine, number one, something fell through in their life, and all of their usual resources have failed them, and so now they're going to try something spiritual to maybe help. Number two, they're weighing, they need a new religion. They need a new spiritual angle, and so maybe I'm going to try this other church, or maybe I'm going to try this other religion, or maybe I'm going to try this other God. Now, all of the imagined pride of the atheist, when people get in trouble, seems to go by the wayside. People get religious very quickly because they are looking to make their lives better in the ways that they can appreciate. And again, so and understanding God as this intersubjective community orientation device really holds true in that. Now the imagined ontology of God number two, again, as we listen to Matt Dillahunty, he really leans on the God number two aspect of this in the world. You know, as I said, you know, is there design in the world, or is the world designed to have dramatic potential which we can unlock using reason? Now, I was just listening to the Modernitas section of Tom Holland's Dominion, and you very quickly see that reason, you know, when the church, especially during the pre-colonial period, so these Jesuit missionaries go out to China, and basically the Chinese emperor is looking to find out how to predict the eclipse. And we're the late medieval, early modern period, and right now they're starting to, you know, they're getting better at math, and they're beginning to get better at prediction, and the Copernican model is beginning to take over. And so this Jesuit priest goes to China, and basically he kicks the butt of all the previous emperor advisors in terms of being able to predict the eclipse. And suddenly, well, now the emperor, they have the interest of the emperor of China. And so, wow, so there must be something to these people. They seemingly can better discern the patterns of the world. I also just watched Jonathan Peugeot's, I thought it was an excellent video on Alexander the Great. And why would these Christians really look up to Alexander the Great? Well, obviously Alexander the Great, even though he was a pagan, by virtue of the dramatic success that he had in the world, could figure out something about the world. And that's really very analogous to science, because they're noticing the patterns, they're able to represent the patterns in their mind's eye, they're able to act with rationality in this predictable context. But again, it doesn't explain, even though you're able to work within a predictable context, it doesn't explain why the context is so predictable. It doesn't explain why the patterns are so built in. And this is, again, in some ways, as opposed to certain other religious and historical systems that said basically the world is just chaos. You have to ask the question, to what can we attribute the patterns, and to what can we attribute our capacity to recognize the patterns as such and engage with them productively towards the ends to which we desire? Okay, so what does it mean to explain something by natural causes or forces? And is human design, for example, excluded by explaining how wings give lift? Oh, now we know that wings give lift, therefore we know that the Wright brothers are only a story. No, the Wright brothers figured it out. It's just that the Wright brothers are within our sphere of knowledge, unlike, you know, inventors of the wheel and inventors of predictable ways of doing fire. We don't imagine that, you know, the wheel was, you know, the wheel is now demythologized because we can figure out that people figured out how to make it. That argument doesn't really hold. Now, what's interesting is that, again, in the, let's see, where are we? Oh yeah, so another point that I wanted to make, and we'll get into this again when we go back to the unbelievable video. One of the issues that I've been thinking about a lot, partly my conversations with Jeff Quackenbush, you know, really, you know, pushed me on some of these issues, is the question of source and stream, or really source within the stream. And Dillahunty makes some fair points when he says, wow, you Christians, you know, everything good that comes around you comes down the stream you credit Christianity for, and everything bad that comes down the stream you credit something else. And fair enough. The difficulty that we have is, well, it's helpful to remember, number one, we're playing a little tribal rivalry game because we want to score points for Christianity in the process. And then we should ask some deeper probing questions. Why do we want to do this? And you know, if it's after a person or a movement, is that person or a movement the cause? And when we're talking about things like humanism, it's a huge development that goes over very long periods of time. How can we justify the attribution? Does the attribution matter? If so, why or why not? Now, again, as Christians, as tribal Christians, we want to say things like, Jesus is the Son of God because he introduced this idea that won. Now, is it because the idea won that we like him, or is it because just about everybody today simply has embraced the ideas? Some of the most dramatic things about the work that Tom Holland has been doing is that, and I think Rene Girard is in this category too, they're able to, in many ways, attribute these ideas that we in the humanist West, whether secular or Christian, embrace as self-evident. the self-evidently good. And again, what struck me in this conversation with Matt Dillahunty is how deeply Christian Matt's ideas are about people to a degree. And again, the argument coming from Tom Holland and Glen Scrivener and Douglas Murray is the concern that when the hand says to the arm, I have no part of you, what happens to the hand after that? So we have these questions really about participation and corruption. If you lose the narrative which has yielded this phenomenon, let's call secular humanism, if you lose the narrative behind it, does that narrative yield a life-giving force to the impetus? And if we lose that narrative, does then the impetus go away? So let's jump back into the conversation.
But to the extent that's true, can we just say that Christianity is the Hammurabic code swapped out or upgraded or changed, or that all of this is derivative?
See, and I think both Dillahunty and Sam Harris, listening to the conversation that Sam Harris had with Brett Weinstein, and this is a version sort of Brett's position. Brett's a little less tentative, a little more tentative than Sam on whether we can just junk the Christian stuff because, well, now we've got the fruit of it. Why can't we just embrace the fruit and carry on? And I think Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, Glen Scrivener all want to say, I'm a little nervous about doing that because it's sort of like taking the fruit out of the garden and saying, well, we're no longer going to tend the garden. We're just going to take the fruit and the fruit will be good enough. And here Matt Dillahunty, I think, is saying, okay, well, whether we got this from Christianity, I don't care because, and this is almost the identical argument that Sam Harris makes. I think it's a powerful argument that, well, if we can arrive at, so we have a common morality that both Christians and secular humanists can embrace. And okay, let's say it came to us via Christianity, fine, let's assume that. But if we no longer need Christianity to justify the moral questions, and in fact, perhaps we can justify the moral questions better without the woo, without the Christianity, without the appeal to a God, without any attempt to pursue a supernatural. And again, there's a lot of this in John Vervaeke's program. Well, then we're better off because then it's grounded on something more stable. Now, there's two elements to that, however, because maybe the more stable, you imagine it more stable because in your philosophical system, you can ground it. You can sort of, there is a... you can construct a tower of rationality and science that yields this thing. And so therefore for you, that's a better system because you can do the work all the way up and say, here it is. And therefore perhaps we can work it higher. Now the question will be, of course, higher. What will the guiding stars be that help you understand which way is up? The other question, however, which is kind of stalks this conversation, which I don't know if I'll get into it so much in this video, but maybe in a future video. But I always imagine future videos I don't do, so maybe I should do a question and answer sometime with y'all to keep me honest to things that I think about and never follow through with. That's the question of, really people at the high, the first... That we can derive ourselves this scientific project that yields the same secular humanism without appeals to the supernatural or Christianity, and therefore it's a better system. Or is something a better system if it's in fact scalable? That people of low IQ, people of different education, people of minimal education, people who don't read books, people who, in fact, are walking around with, let's say, the basic package of human susceptibility to magical thinking can actually embrace and pursue. This is especially true if we're imagining that, well, we have a democracy here, and in many ways the way democracies function is that it's the common ideas of the people, not the elites, of the people that tends to get displayed in the legislature and tends to get codified as, well, this is what's good, this is what's right. So is it in fact some moral system that extremely intelligent and articulate people who read the kinds of books that there are not a whole lot of them selling, will that get filtered then down through the movies? And it's a real question in terms of which type of system is better. Is the scalable system better, that is replete with mythology and story, that actually moves massive numbers of people, because massive numbers of people are far more equipped to deal with a story-based system? Or is it that system which only those, and Jordan Peterson is quite articulate when he makes the point that very few people can really think scientifically. Very few people are going to delve into, even when you look at, say, John Vervaeke's project, 51-hour videos, and we're spanning philosophy and history and cognitive science, and after going through all 50 hours, it's very clear that the 50 hours is just the tip of the iceberg, because if you want to understand Kant or Hegel or Aristotle or Plato or Heidegger or any of these giants, or Nietzsche or Jung, and then once you begin to study them, you begin to see the people around them, and you begin to say, oh my goodness, how on earth could I embrace that? When you discover that a meme or a fable or a story colonizes people far more quickly than these ideas. Now, these ideas do trickle down, but yeah, but they also keep changing in terms of the high climbers of the culture. So, okay, back to this video.
At some point, we're talking about human beings and how they choose to try to answer the questions and live lives cooperatively. Whether you're going back to animism and some tribal struggle, then this becomes a more codified sort of language, and when people aren't paying attention to it and the village elder is no longer a sufficient authority, we appeal to one outside of there. I mean, this would also be a sufficient explanation for the history of religion. So to say that secular humanism is a newly packaged, light, modified version of Christianity really isn't relevant if Christianity is a modified version of other things that all tie back to the human being.
Which is a big if, and I don't think it is at all. I think what you get when you...
And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about too, that I want to get into at some point, is in terms of how Christians love to argue, so much of Christian argumentation has sort of been built on the natural supernatural divide, okay, and revelation. And you're not going to find me denying revelation, but I think it's helpful to talk a little bit more carefully about what revelation is, and hopefully I'll get into that more. But the Christians very much want to highlight the antithesis, and that's fair. There are antitheses, and that's a function of reality, and they should be highlighted, but there are also continuities that are helpful to recognize as well.
You look at human civilizations, what you get when you look at the Hammurabi Code, when you look at the Enuma Elish, when you look at any number of the ancient Near Eastern texts, when you look at any number of Greco-Roman understandings of the world, or Persian understanding of the world, or Muslim understanding of the world, it is basically that in the realm of the flesh, in the realm of biological reality, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore sacrifice of the weakest. And I think what you get absolutely uniquely in Christianity is the reverse of that.
Now, this is a powerful point that Glen makes, that now survival of the fittest isn't necessarily survival of the strongest, and Dillahunty will make that point. But then we get into the relevance realization, John Vervaeke's relevance realization. Now, what's so odd about Christianity is that Jesus' take seems so anti-Darwinian. And there are a number of aspects of Jesus' ministry that seem in many ways so anti-Darwinian. Number one, Jesus even by his biographers in the Gospels, doesn't seem to win the crowd beyond sort of the appetites of the crowd for a miracle show, getting their diseases healed and getting some free bread. The people that cheer Jesus coming into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday seem to have abandoned him by Thursday night. And this says a lot about human beings. And I've made this point before that, well, let's imagine the greatest Christian preacher of all time must be Jesus. Why wasn't there this mass revival that sort of swept Galilee and then Judea to the degree that even the Romans or the religious officials that were envious of him couldn't stop? John the Baptist was a tremendously powerful preacher, not sufficiently powerful enough to save him from Herod, but tremendously powerful preacher whose tribe would be in existence for another couple of centuries after John the Baptist lived. That's a matter of historical record. Now, of secular historical record, let me say. Now, Jesus seems to do, and I remember having a conversation with someone who was post-Christian, and I made the observation to him that, there are a lot of reasons to not live like Jesus because what it got him was dead by 33. None of us look upon that as being successful. And Jesus adopts this idea of turning the other cheek, of giving the cloak away, of loving your enemy. And whereas this idea continues to be attractive to us for some strange reason, it's very counter-Darwinian in some ways, yet it endures. And yet we don't like to practice it for the most obvious reasons. And Jesus seems to instantiate this idea up the hierarchy. And this gets back to Tom Holland's amazingly insight that this guy who claimed to in some way be the source of all being in the universe gets killed as a slave, and 4 writers manage to make him so outrageously attractive that people from nearly every culture throughout human history find him at least interesting enough to not put him down, and sufficiently interesting that no small number of people throughout the world begin to agree with his connection with the source of all being. That's an astounding literary accomplishment. And that 4 authors did it and didn't go on to be William Shakespeare and have dozens of other popular things that go on through time. And the thing that they all 4 have together, writing within just years or decades of each other in the first century, is that they're writing about Jesus. That is a historical fact that shouldn't be dismissed too quickly. So, fair enough that stuff comes down to us, but Jesus is a big deal. Not easily just pushed aside. Now, you could say you push him aside, but there's a few billion people living today and more as you go into the realm of the dead that say, no, big deal.
You have in Christ the fittest who is sacrificed for the survival of the weakest. And what you get birthed out of the Christian movement is a unique preference for the poor, the marginalized, the weak, the outsider, to draw them in, such that obviously in every society there's tit for tat, and there's let's cooperate and let's do all that kind of stuff. But who is we in that sentence?
And we cooperate to compete. That Brett Weinstein put that one in my head. That's an amazing insight.
Let us cooperate. Well, who's the us? It could be just you and me and not Justin, or it could be just me and Justin and not you, right? Who are the people on planet Earth who are actually saying it's actually all of us, even our enemies, are those who we include in the circle of humanity and who we grant equal human dignity to, and who we say they must never be marginalized, no matter how weak they are, no matter how ineffectual they are, no matter how maladapted to survival they are. They are ours, and we will grant them a universal human dignity. That's a thoroughly Christian idea, and it's not, it's obviously it's found on the first page of the Bible, so it's there in Judaism, but it is a uniquely Christian idea that I think secular humanism has taken on. But I don't think you derive that secular humanism anywhere else but in Christianity
and Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
let's call it the Judeo-Christian worldview,
sure,
or whatever.
And I want to kvetch about this a little bit, because I think the roots of it are, in fact, right there in Genesis 1. But, and I think you see signs of it in the inclusion of the rabble in the Exodus. You see signs of it that people, men can become Jews via circumcision, and women via this ceremonial bath that will become Christian baptism. But it is in fact Jesus that presses this point home. Now, if you keep listening to this video, what you hear again and again is the category of human being. And what I want to argue is that this category of human being, in fact, comes to us via Christianity. And it's not that ancients didn't understand the difference between a human being and a dog, or a human being and an ox, or a human being and a lion. It's this regard for one another that takes off in Christianity that Glen has just, and I think this is the strongest point he presses Dillahunty with, and he keeps coming back to it. And I think finally Dillahunty can't answer Glen's charge that this comes into human history via Jesus. And, a number of years ago I read Hampton Side's really interesting book, Blood and Thunder. And it's the story of Kit Carson and the conquest of the American West. And very early on in the book, one of the things that gets recognized is that, well, they're the Navajo here. And the Navajo, well, the word Navajo is a word of the Pueblo Indians. No, okay, Pueblo. Who are the Pueblo Indians? The Anasazi. We're going to get into these names because the names we usually get for these tribes are in fact from their enemies. Because the word Navajo is a Pueblo Indian origin, meaning people of the Great Planted Fields. Well, maybe. The first appeared in Spanish documents in 1628. The Navajo didn't call themselves that. The Navajo called themselves the Dene, which simply means the people. And now, if you start poking around in anthropology in these, it's sort of like the Tom Holland, people didn't know they had a religion until Christians came along and said that they had one, and then they began to recognize it. That sort of happens with this idea of people, because it seems almost all the world over, almost all the way throughout time, there's people, there's us, and then there's them. There's the in-group and then the out-group. And the in-group is people, and the out-group is barbarian or enemy or Gentile. And this was fully within the religion of the Jewish people, all the way to the book of Acts, when at the beginning of the book of Acts the disciples asked Jesus, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? And it seems like all of the stuff that Jesus was doing subtly through the Gospels of not carrying on the very understandable subtle cultural war against Roman occupation, that this gets full blown then into the controversy that will erupt in the very early church between the Judaizers and the new Christians that are coming into the faith via Paul. And this gets played out in the book of Galatians and over in the New Testament. And in fact, they're going to talk a bit about slavery in this, but never do they bring up the fact that in many ways these issues are dealt with in very subtle early ways in the New Testament. And the New Testament itself has the record of the struggle of these ideas, whether or not the people can be, as we find finally in the book of Revelation, people from every tongue and language, and they're not circumcised. And then the question becomes, well, how do we know someone is a Christian? Just this week I'm preaching from the baptism of Jesus, and John the Baptist says to the Pharisees and Sadducees, who are kind of looking there, watching the goings on in judgment, and John says, "Don't consider yourself exempt from the judgment of the Lord, because you are the children of Abraham. God can raise children of Abraham out of the stones." And in fact, what happens in Christianity is, in fact, that your identity can be changed via a religious conversion and via the entrance into a new community. And whereas before it was Jews had their religion and Persians had their religion, and everybody had their religion and their gods, and via polytheism there could be a certain amount of religious lubrication going on so that people could live next to each other. Fundamentally, it was us against them, and us is our family or our tribe, and they are the others. And they are the enemy. In fact, this goes further. There was another site that I looked up about names. And in fact, the point of the names, which is very 20th century via Europe of self-determination, those ideas have roots too. Well, so what should we call these people that were in North America, if we dare call it North America, when the Europeans came over? The conundrum of names doesn't end here. Some of the traditional or real names are not actually derived from the people themselves, just as we saw from Navajo. Navajo doesn't come from Navajo, comes from the Pueblans. The name, the one before, the name Anasazi, when I went to the cliff dwellers and those cliff dweller ruins in southwest Colorado. There was, I always wanted to see those. So myself and my wife and one of our sons, who was still living at home at that time, we went down to southern Colorado and we saw the cliff dwellers. At first, we saw the Anasazi, and then we began to notice that all the signs were in the process of changing. Why? Because the ancestors of the Anasazi said, that's not really our name for ourselves. Because before it was sort of like, well, Anasazi, that means ancient people, but a little bit more digging resulted in, that's a Navajo word, and it means enemy ancestors. and some say that's not exactly what it means. It means something much more brutal. And in fact, this comes up all over the place in North America, because North America was not one big happy nation of one people and then the Europeans. The categorization of one color of people and another color of people. In fact, there was multiple peoples, and they were all having wars between each other. And there's us, and then there's them. And so Mohawk is a Narragansett name meaning flesh eaters. Sioux is a French corruption of a Anishinaabe word for enemy. In fact, many of these names mean enemy. Simply Apache is a Spanish corruption of a Zuni word for enemy, while Navajo is from a Spanish term of the Tiwa word. If we want to be fully authentic in every instance, we will have to inquire into the language of each people to find the name that they call themselves. And they probably is just people, or Dine, as in the Navajo. It may not be surprising to find that the deepest real names, how do we know what's real, is often the word for people, or for the homeland, or for some differentiating characteristic of the people as seen through their own eyes. And so what happens here?
Let's credit the Abrahamic God with everything. And when I look at it, my issue is, if there is an Abrahamic God, okay.
Now again, pay attention to, in the imaginary, that this way of talking is relevant. Okay, we got this God, this actor, this being out here that's doing stuff. Very much God number two.
That's an important question, which I guess we're going to somewhat sideline, because at the end of the day, this notion that human beings who care about human beings are not going to come up with multiple...
Again, human beings. What's a human being? The Navajo didn't see it that way. The Anasazi, or the ancient Puebloan, we don't know what to call them. The people. All of the different the peoples didn't see it that way. Now suddenly we're talking about human beings as one thing. This is all from Christianity.
Different ways of...
And in fact, I'd argue that what we learned from the Indian names, or Well, we learned from the names that I just talked about, is that, in fact, the default position of people is us and them. And regarding all of humanity as human beings, that came from someone. And, in fact, it is an achievement that was bought through through centuries and centuries of struggle with this. Christians and non-Christians, Calvinists and Arminians, Catholics and Protestants, Christians and Muslims, on and on and on and on, all these categories. That this humanism is in fact an achievement.
Structuring a society, and that some of those, which may be consistent with your view and understanding of Christianity, which I would argue is perhaps different than some other people's view and understanding of Christianity. I don't think that's particularly contentious at this point. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that this is Christianity light and modified and updated, or that it's all derived from Christianity as the original source, because that presumes that there's something other than human beings that are the original source for.
But you're using the category of human beings, and that has a source. And again, what you see in here is just sort of the self-evident assumptions of there's such a thing as human beings and not us and them, in terms of how we act and how we regard someone else. And that behavior has its genesis in someone, because in many, many places in world history, that behavior gets you killed, or it gets your crops eaten by someone else.
For those ideas. The fact that...
But for him, for Dillahunty, it's just self-evident.
They became popular within Christianity. You know, that you have somebody talking about blessed are the meek. Did that ultimately lead some people to the United Nations Universal Code of Human Ethics type stuff and secular humanism? Sure. Because we're all together on a planet, and these ideas get...
We're all together on a planet. Again, the conceptualization of it. I think it's really hard to say. It doesn't come from the one who on the cross said to forgive those who were crucifying him because they didn't know what they were doing, even though they were Roman.
Passed around, and my take on it has always been, take the best ideas wherever you find them, get rid of the rest.
How do you know what the best is? Because you're the one judging it. But now we're getting into morality, because morality is the question of, well, what is best? Well, what is best for what? Now, I wanted to get into, this is the slide that I skipped. You know, one of the real treasures I gleaned from Thornton Peterson was Piaget's equilibrated state. How do we know what is better or what is worse from something?
Made an Egyptian whose name was Hagar. So this is a big catastrophe for Abraham, especially in those times, and perhaps now as much, although perhaps people aren't as conscious of it as they once were. I mean, for Abraham, without a biological son, there was no vision forward into the future.
Now here's an element of the Bible that we too quickly overlook, that in fact what the Bible affords us is a view into the values of ancient people. And again, for Abraham, the value for Abraham was, well, how is death beaten? Death is beaten through children. So I live on through my ancestors. So there's a really strong value. And that's a really strong value about us and them. Because what you want to do is have all of the food, and you want your tribe to multiply, because basically military strength was directly related to population, health, and food security. And so what you find in a lot of the Bible is a war in the Iron Age over food security. And so what Abraham wants to do is Abraham wants to be the father of nations. That's what everybody wants to do right then. And again, in fact, you find this strange anti-Darwinian perspective in the Bible all the way from Abraham, because at the end of the Tower of Babel, you have another catastrophe, and so God's going to take a new tact in terms of how to redeem the world, and he's going to do it through nation building. And the one qualification you're looking for someone to be father of nation is that the original pair would be fertile. And that's exactly the aspect that we see in Abraham and Sarah, is that they can't have children. Well, there's a storyline developing somewhere in terms of, what might this God, very much God number 2, what might this God be doing and be after? And how might it, in fact, be antithetical?
And I mean, we don't really know what sort of time span over which these archaic people fought, but the medieval people, we already said, could think 300 years into the future without batting an eye. And these people who were concerned about their descendants were obviously thinking about existence in a way that wasn't just focused on their immediate existence, right? They were thinking about, well, their children and their grandchildren, and maybe their great-grandchildren, and maybe the whole society that stemmed out from them. And that's smart. You know, one of the things I learned from Piaget, at least in part, was that his idea of the equilibrated state, which he thought about as part of the biological basis of the idea of moral progress. It's something like that. He was very, very smart, Piaget. And he said that the proper equilibrated state is one where, imagine you have a family, you've got 5 people in it, and you're doing what you want. And
Now, morality, again, is about what you do, and it's what you do towards the good. But what is, in fact, the good, and how can we know the good? Well, we're always looking for ways that we can know the good, because the difficulty is we don't know the ends of the things that we do. And one of my favorite Jordan Peterson passages from his 2017 Maps of Meaning course was he asked the question, what is the automobile? Well, the automobile is a way to get from A to B without horse poop on the streets. It's also a way to completely change cities in the world. And it's also a way to have tens of thousands of people die every year trying to get from A to B. And it's also a way of churning every gallon of gasoline into 21 pounds of CO2. It's in fact many, many things. And we don't know what we do when we do something. And we find this all the time in human history. And so what we're always trying to do is know outcomes and know ends. And so we're always looking for ways to try to conceptualize the good. And in fact, when Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris talks about well-being, that's another attempt, but it's a pretty thin one, because what we tend to find is that, and this I hear again and again in these videos, is that we can simply assume that we know. Well, it's obvious. We can just tell it. Well, is it obvious? Is it obvious to us now that, you know, the Manhattan Project was a good idea? Is it obvious to us now to have related to certain nations at certain times in certain ways? We were the ones that started the Iranian nuclear program. Atoms for peace all around the world. The United States, does that seem like a good idea now? You go through history and you find this again and again. We find it in our own little lives. And so, in fact, one of the ways to conceptualize of religion is that it is a sustained effort on the part of humanity to try to traverse time in terms of learning through time about what is the good. Well, back to Piaget.
In your family, what's good for you. But you're doing it in such a way so that the other 4 members of your family agree with what you do, and that it also facilitates them doing what they want and what they should be doing. And so it's a really tricky arrangement, because it isn't just for you. It's for you in a way that's for them. And you could also see that that would be something that would be a multiplier, right? Because if you have everyone working voluntarily towards the same common goal, then you get a multiplying effect of that. And then you might think, well, it's not just you.
And you're going to have to conceptualize that goal. And you're going to have to deliver that goal in a way that not only the most intelligent people of your community can understand, not only the way that the most educated people of your community can understand, but that, in fact, all of the other people who don't have time to sit and read books can understand. And in fact, it fits very well into their self-conceptualization, which probably means it's a story, because that's our fundamental self-conceptualization of how we live in this world.
And your family, it's you and your family today, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 10 years from now. So you have to take the time span into account. And then it should be you and your family in a way that works well in society, and then it should work well.
See, now we're branching out beyond the family, but society, my society, there's an identity thing, and we're gonna span beyond identities here.
Now and next week and next year and into the future. It should be iteratable, right? That's like sustainability. It's something like the idea of sustainability. And that's I would say that's a reasonable way of conceptualizing the holy city. It's something like that. You know, if you're trying to make it concrete, it's like, how should you live your life? Well, let's say you live your life in a manner that justifies its limitation and tragedy. That's a good start. but then let's say that it does that in a way that also reduces the limitations and suffering of the people that you interact with. And
okay, limits their suffering. Well, what kind of suffering? Well, because some of the suffering you think is good and some of the suffering that you think is bad. And in fact, sometimes you want your enemies to suffer because you want them to change their ways, and sometimes you want to encourage. And so, in fact, suffering itself isn't itself even that good of, that isn't a universal tell.
Now and into the future. Well, maybe there's a way to do that. I mean, a good negotiation does that, right? Because if you're negotiating with someone like your wife, for example, what you want is for her to agree with the negotiation. And one of the things that Piaget said, which I think was brilliant, he said, if you take an equilibrated system, a family, let's say, and a disequilibrated system, so that would be one where, let's say, the father is a tyrant and everyone is operating under his whip, and you put them in a head-to-head competition, the equilibrated system will outcompete the disequilibrated system because the enforcement cost is such that it will slow the system down.
And what this demonstrates is that voluntarism, you have to, in a sense, colonize the moral imagination of not just a few people at the top, but in fact, an entire community, so that they, in fact, can all share this idea together. And I think part of what we see with Matt Dillahunty in terms of, well, he seems to be sharing these ideas that the weak and that's what we should do. Well, he's been colonized.
You know, because you'll get resistances from the people inside the system. The system will be working at counter purposes to itself, plus there's enforcement costs. And so a tyranny cannot beat an equilibrated system. And I was really excited to encounter that idea, because when I encountered it, I was also trying to figure out if there was some quantitative difference between the systems, say, of the Soviet Union and Maoist China and the systems of the West, apart from just, you know, arbitrary world interpretation as the postmodern nihilists might have it, if there was something fundamental at stake in the terrible Cold War that we fought, or if it was just a matter of opinion. You know, and the Piagetian take was that, well, roughly speaking, is that the West was an equilibrated system, not perfectly equilibrated, but reasonably equilibrated, in that people were essentially, even if they were slaves to some degree, they were at least voluntary slaves instead of involuntary slaves, and that was better. The system was actually technically better, and not just as a matter of interpretation. So that's a lovely thing to know, and I think it's a really solid idea. I haven't been able to, you know, put crowbars under that idea and lift it up. I think it's a good one. So,
and what's interesting in this is that actually later in this conversation with Dillahunty, one aspect of this conversation is it right? But the aspect of it that doesn't seem to get enough attention is, can you move the world with it? And if people are naturally religious, if you're, and I think this is part of the reason that the new atheists are a short-lived movement, is people are naturally religious. You're bucking human evolution by going counter to religion. And what I made this point in the article I wrote on the Dave Rubin John Lennox conversation, that you're kind of bucking human history with this, and that's why I think Scott Alexander in Slate Star Codex said basically, we've seen the end of the new atheists, because their system can't stand. You know, whether or not they imagine that their system is superior in terms of the philosophical argumentation that they try to bear, in terms of how human beings work, for the most part, what we've seen is that when people throw off the traditional, better structured, better thought through inherited religions that they have, and they start ad hocing it, it gets worse. And society, in fact, has less cohesion than what they had before. One of the things that strikes me is how well ancient and medieval societies were able to cohere. I was watching the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War, and Shelby Foote, who's one of the more colorful commentators in there, makes the point that you had Union and Rebel soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. There's a little tongue twister. in the face of these mini balls that were going to mow them down. Now, on one hand, you can say, well, that's a stupid way to fight. But on the other hand, you recognize, look at the courage. I just watched the movie Little Women last night, and it's a lovely movie. But you know, even through that movie, which is a thin lens, when you read the kinds of letters that come out of the Civil War, and in many ways, we are lesser ancestors of greater people. Now, we look back and we say, oh, they were horrible people. They had, we can find all sorts of ideas that we despise in their heads. Yeah, but what they were able to do in terms of, let's think about these Union soldiers that went down to fight for this cause. Well, again, that was incredibly complicated because they were fighting for their state, not maybe for the Union, but the courage that they were able to show. Get back to the video that I'm supposed to be talking about.
And so from, the Bible, I can pull out some really good ideas and I can get rid of its support for slavery.
But again, you're doing all of the sifting. And and again, I think Brett Weinstein said it so well, the Bible isn't the Bible just because there are a few nuggets in there. The Bible is the Bible because of this long-term process that it went through. And to simply discard it, you're taking a risk. And you're taking a risk with a lot of us.
Or genocide or misogyny or any of those things. I don't have to hang on to the baggage or claim that I'm doing it because there's
in a sense, though,
God.
you're getting rid of everything, including God, obviously, in the process of doing that. And it is your argument, Glenn, that there's a danger in doing that. You can't simply have the ethics without some of the supporting foundations, presumably, that you think are...
Which is Nietzsche's critique as well. Yeah, absolutely. That you get rid of the God of Christianity, and you must get rid of the ethics of Christianity as well, because it is founded on the God who took flesh, who became the weak one, in order to rise up again and bring us weak ones into his family. And he uniquely gives to the entire human race a dignity, which you can kind of secularize that term and call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that's basically the Imago Dei. That's basically the image of God from Genesis chapter 1.
See, and I'd argue that Imago Dei is the seed, but that gets born out in Christ and Paul and the New Testament, in a way that, that's the whole issue of the conflict with the Judaizers, that the New Testament writings are just simply shot through with.
So wait, on one hand, you seem to be saying you can't remove God and still maintain these things, and yet you're claiming that secular humanism has done exactly that.
Secularism has done exactly that, or hasn't done exactly that?
Has done exactly that. That when I advocate for secular humanist principles, when I do that I'm basically taking the principles that you see in Christianity and just removing God from it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So clearly you can do that.
You can do that, but on what grounds now?
Well, I don't know if it's on what grounds, but I'd argue about sustainability. Because what I would argue is that, okay, so you've got one camp says that here we have this system that is derived from our philosophy and from all of this thinking that we do because we've read a tremendous amount of books and we've had all the best and we've got this system. And what you've got is a bunch of stories. Yeah. But which side is going to move the world? I wanted to, Dillahunty's going to make a point about kind of a different take on, God sacrificing his son. And through all of that stuff, I just wanted to say, René Girard. But then they jump into this, which I think is one of the critical elements of this video.
Old Testament. But that's got to be interesting, at least, because we can't do a compare and contrast. There's no A/B testing about this. Okay, there's only
which I think kind of undermines what you were just saying. And sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm in agreement with you. Mm-hmm. You're viewing it as nobody else has done this, and you don't think anybody else could. And my thing is, we have no way to find that out because we live in a world where this is the way things happened.
And that's exactly right. You can't rewind history and say, well, if Jesus had decided that once he had that big crowd in Galilee, he had said, all right, well, let's get some pointed sticks and let's take over a few towns here and let's kill some Gentiles and let's make this place safe for our holy book and our holy people and unsafe for other people. And, well, you know, but one of the nice things about history is that in terms of people and ideas, there were plenty of people that tried that idea with the Romans. And in fact, in 68 AD, 271 AD, well, that pretty much failed. And one of the beautiful things we have about history is that, in fact, history is itself a lesson about winners and losers. And we can argue this from a Darwinian perspective. In fact, this is the whole conceptualization that Brett Weinstein has about a Darwinian view of religion as an adaptation within human history. And that's sort of something what Jordan Peterson is talking about in terms of the equilibrated state, one which is voluntary and the other which is forced, a tyranny that's forced upon its people, that free societies will in the end win out because people want to be free. And so the real quest is in fact to colonize the ideas and win the war of ideas. But that winning the war of ideas is not just people who seem to have the best ideas amongst their little ivory tower of all the academics, but the people who have their best ideas that actually flow in the streets. Okay? Because people are adapted to these ideas.
And so to argue that you couldn't actually write a list of moral precepts from scratch that are superior to Christianity.
Well, but then aren't you saying, okay, at least with the Christian side, we've got, there is one group of people that has guaranteed universal equality for all human beings and has ended the slave trade. Okay? It might have taken far longer than you would have wanted it to have taken. But there is one group of people who've done that. We don't know if anyone has or could do that. Let's give it a go anyway. Let's walk away from this thing that has given us all these benefits of the universities and the hospitals and the schools and the scientific method and the emancipation of the slaves and all this sort of stuff. Let's walk away from that. That's quite a leap of faith, don't you think?
And am I also getting the sense, Glenn, that, I mean, I want to come back to this human at the centre of this and the fact that Matt says, hey, humans are humans, and yeah, it's natural that we're going to prefer ourselves, and that's where the morality comes from, our own best interest.
Again, we're going to prefer ourselves as humans. Well, you've already imbibed and conceptualized one human family. Now, what may be coming down the road is that, well, through taking these, my cell phone's way over there on the desk. It's not in my holder. That once we take this technology and we wire it into our heads, and once we, Jordan Peterson talked a lot about this, and that really caught my attention. Once we basically say that, all of the people with IQs less than 100, they're dead weight. And, well, maybe we won't kill them. Maybe we'll find some really comfy chairs and some really engaging VR and a really powerful chemical. We'll call it soma, and we'll put them in a chair and we'll just let them drift off, and they'll be very happy, and then they'll go quietly. And in fact, if you try to take them out of their comfy chair, or take the soma away, or take the VR away, then they'll be angry with you. So that's what they want. That's what they choose. And so maybe then we can have A, B, C's, D's, Brave New World, or maybe we can have gold, silver, and bronze, Plato's Republic, and eventually what we're going to have to do is we're going to better mankind in the ways that we imagine they should be bettered. A little bit later in this, they're going to get into Nazism, and I don't think I'm going to go that far because I've got to go home and eat dinner. But a little bit later in this, they're going to get into the Nazi question. And one of the interesting things about what happened in the Second World War was that in the West, as well as in Germany, ideas of eugenics, and again, I'd encourage you to read plenty of literature in the early 20th century. Ideas of eugenics this was science. This was how we're going to better the race. We're going to sterilize the feeble-minded and not allow them to reproduce. And, this is how, in fact, we compete against other nations. Now, don't for a minute imagine that these ideas aren't going to come back. Maybe they will. Maybe 200 years from now, people will be sitting around and saying, "I'm not going to watch Vanderklay. His IQ was too low, so let's ban his videos." What is a human being? What qualifies for life?
And you're saying no, somehow Christianity has actually grounded an intrinsic dignity to the human that Matt's godless ethics isn't necessarily going to support. It might go in that direction for them for a moment, but there's no ultimate foundation to it. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Absolutely. I mean, we are always going to look after ourselves, but who is we and who are ourselves in that conversation? And we are always wanting to narrow the circle around us and our mates and exclude the other tribe and exclude the other kinds of people. So, you know, in the news here in the UK, just recently they brought in a non-invasive prenatal test for Down syndrome. And it had the reliable effect that everybody knew it was going to have. As people knew that they were going to have children with Down syndrome, they aborted them at ever higher rates. And yet the headlines said, children with Down syndrome down 30%. And it sounded like people had found a cure for Down syndrome or something like that. They hadn't found a cure for Down syndrome. They'd just drawn the circle around humanity and kept those with that condition on the outside and wanted to eliminate them. And that to me is a very chilling way of proceeding with a kind of a humanism, because that's always the danger. Like, who is us? Who are those who we are going to grant with the right to life? And who are those who we are going to say, they do not qualify? And it's always tempting for the humans to say, okay, it's the strong who will make the decision, and it's the weak who must take the hindmost. What is it that's going to stand up for all humans, regardless of capacity, regardless of attributes, regardless of achievements? Who is it who's going to stand up for all humans and actually be true humanists and grant them human rights too?
This is the problem. So first of all, whether or not that abortion scenario that you're talking about is humanism or not is subject for a whole nother debate. But you say, well, nobody could do this. And then when we talk about, here's a list of precepts where we don't include a God in it, then your answer is, now you're just borrowing from Christianity. It's Christianity light, and you've just removed the God. And then the other objection that you're going to launch to secular morality is, what's going to be the foundation beyond this? At least we have a foundation. It's God. Well, what if people don't accept your foundation? That is exactly the same objection that you are leveraging, you're launching at secular humanism. Whatever problems secular humanism may have with regard to foundations of ethics, no religious foundation has any way of solving that. Because ultimately, until some God comes in and says, I am in fact the God of the universe and I am the moral authority, and people are forced to recognize that this is the case, then the only thing that's happened.
That to me is an amazing argument, because the Bible addresses that argument again and again and again and again and again. Because the argument in the Bible is, okay, Sinai, let's whether or not you imagine it happened, let's look at the scenario. God comes down on Sinai, says, here's the law. What do the people say? Shut them up, we don't want to hear it. You can't tell people what to do, or part of us, this is back to Augustine and the forbidden fruit. I wanted to steal those pears. I wasn't even hungry. I just wanted to do it. This is how we are, and that's part of the point of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. This is how we are. And so morality gets into us indirectly, usually through stories, through experiences, through things that people can scale. One of the things that I've noticed in my life as a pastor is that I know a lot of smart people. And one of the things that I've heard about intelligence is intelligence doesn't necessarily help people do the right thing. Intelligence helps people to tell stories to justify what they're doing, helps them to tell better stories. And what I've seen many times in my life as a pastor is that so often I have noticed some of the people who have the lower IQs are the simplest. I have seen them, in terms of Christian morality, outperform me, outperform many of those who were theologians and could write great books. Why? I've seen this, because they say, Jesus tells me to be a servant. I'm going to do it. It's a low IQ person often. and they stick with it. Whereas the smart people have all sorts of rationalizations not to. And if you imagine that, well, somehow there's going to be a system. Okay, so there's no God. So Sam Harris says to do this, and he's got the best arguments. How long's that really going to last? Really, how long's that going to last? I mean, it's not winning the field now. And if you stand that against this book of stories that he says are clearly substandard, his butt is getting kicked by the book of stories.
Happening is Glen's saying God is the foundation of morality, and I'm saying humans are. And nobody is going to be, neither of those systems is going to work for people who don't accept that that's a foundation.
Do people have to all recognize his foundation in order for it to be the foundation?
See, and what I would argue is that more people recognize the kind of foundation that is built into stories. And I've seen, there's always this debate, you know, how should Christians, so much Christian Sunday school material for a while, and this, you see this perpetuate, we're going to teach children values. And so they teach children values. Tell the truth, you know, don't steal, all of these things. What they've discovered is that these programs don't really work very well. Teach them stories. And in fact, you see this in ancient culture. Listen to Jonathan Peugeot's channel. We work symbolically in a way that is deep within us. And a lot of this higher level cognitive function, well, you have the master and its emissary. It's at the mercy of the limbic system. The smarter the writer, the better the justification and the PR. Doesn't necessarily mean the better the person.
No, and people don't need to recognize that 2 + 2 = 4 for it to be the case that 2 + 2 = 4, and for you to go to your grave proclaiming that 2 + 2 = 4. Even if the whole world said it was otherwise, then 2 + 2 would still equal 4. People don't need to recognize a moral truth to be a moral truth for it to be moral.
And we don't work that directly. We really don't. So that's, I got to go home for dinner. So I hope to come back to this video. I thought it was a great conversation, and I thought both engaged in a good spirit. I really have to do more reading up on Nazis, because, you know, I've read Timothy Snyder, and I've really appreciated his books. And now some people say, well, Timothy Snyder doesn't get the Nazis right. My take on the Nazis is that, in fact, the Nazis followed through with the ideas that were common in the West. Remember, Germany was one of the most Christian nations. Christians shouldn't, you know, shrink from that fact that all of our Christian machinery failed dramatically in resisting Hitler. Christians should not shrink from that. But yet, I suspect if Timothy Snyder is right in terms of his take on what Nazis were, well, they pretty much said, well, maybe we're not, you know, maybe Jews aren't animals, but there's a hierarchy of human beings. There's a master race. There are people that were born to be masters and people that were born to serve. And we should set them off in different places of the world. And in some ways, you know, I believe that consistently, because again, if you've never read Brave New World, you don't understand the thought at the beginning of the 20th century. There it is in many ways in Brave New World. You can find similar ideas in Plato's Republic, and people, you know, Plato's Republic. Well, read Plato's Republic and look at that vision of the world. It's highly rational, because the truth is, you know, let's have all the smart people marry. They'll have smart children. Have dumb people marry. They'll have dumb children. You know, in general, intelligence is passed on in terms of heredity. A lot of things are passed on in terms of heredity. These things I find no agreements with. But what about morality, and how does that work? Can atheism deliver in a better world? What I think Glen is basically arguing is that he fears for the sustainability, because I don't think we even have a very good understanding of what makes people moral. I don't think it's scolding. I don't think it's rationality. It's something far deeper, and usually has a great deal to do with, well, the story of Jesus and his crucifixion. Roman centurion looks up in that story and says, surely this man was the Son of God. What? Really? But here's, again, back to Tom Holland's argument about Jesus. Why could these four authors accomplish that literary feat? Because they're all writing about the same person.